Affaires courantes ordinaires.
Daily routine of business, tabling of documents.
Secretary to the Minister of Export Promotion, International Trade and Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 32.2 and consistent with the policy on the tabling of treaties in Parliament, I have the official language as the treaty entitled Decision Number 1, 2024 of the Joint Committee established by the agreement between Canada and the European Community on Trade in Wines and Spirit Drinks on the 4th of April 2024, amending Annexes 1, 3A, 3B, 4A, and 6 of the agreement between Canada and the European Community on Trade in Wines and Spirit Drinks, adopted at Ottawa and Brussels on April 4th, 2024. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Introduction of government bills. Déclaration de ministre.
Statements by ministers, reports from interparliamentary delegations. Presenting reports from committees. Introduction of private members' bills. First reading of Senate public bills. Motions.
Mr. Waugh, seconded by Mr. Couric, moves that the 8th report on the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage, presented on Tuesday, December 12, 2023, be concurred in. Debate. The honourable member from Saskatoon Grasswood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good morning to everyone coast to coast. As it will be interesting today as we talk about the concurrence motion that we have coming out from the Heritage Committee, and I will be sharing my time with the honourable member from Battle River Crowfoot. Mr. Speaker, you know, last month, I've been on the Heritage Committee now for years, but last month I actually asked my constituents of Saskatoon Grasswood for their views on the public broadcaster, CBC. It was in response to CBC paying out bonuses adding up to over $18 million, which were approved by the Minister of Canadian Heritage and the Privy Council. $3.3 million of that went directly to the CBC executives. And that averaged out, and I couldn't believe the number, because there was 45 executives that had their hand in the pocket of $3.3 million, and it averaged out to $73,000 each. $73,000 each for the executives in 1 year on bonuses, 45 of them. And I see some Liberals there even shaking their heads. Can't believe that number of $73,000 per year just for the executives. That's right. So I asked on a mail out, what do you think we should do going forward with the CBC? Should we do nothing? Keep it as it is? Should we keep it but make some changes, or simply defund the CBC? That's been the narrative of this party, and for very good reason, for months, if not a year and a half now. You know, I literally had hundreds of responses, probably the best response I've had since I've been a member of Parliament for 9 years. 86.5% were in support of overhauling or even defunding the entire operation of CBC. CBC recently, about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, about Canadians actually wanting to defund the CBC entirely. She was caught off guard. The CEO was caught off guard that Canadians are talking about defunding her operation, the CBC. So maybe I should have responded sooner, she said, of the public's outcry on how the corporation is compensated by this federal government. CBC, in their corporate plan summary, tabled in the House of Commons, said viewers are leaving television. Doy, especially young people. They're going to streaming devices. They've been doing that for many, many years. That's certainly not a surprise. But a big surprise to me was the ad revenue. It's dropped another 9.6% in the last 12 months. That is a concern. 9.6% drop in the last 12 months. And I think trust in CBC News organization, as we've seen across this country, has also dropped. So here we have the trust dropping. Here we have the viewership dropping. And here we have the revenue dropping. But what didn't drop? Oh, the bonuses didn't drop. Surprise, surprise. $18 million handed out in the last year. Ms. Tate came before the Heritage Committee for the third time in the last year. She talked about the key performance indicators, better known as KPIs. We love the KPIs. Those determine, she said, the bonus structure. Amazingly, with everything dropping, the viewership, the revenue, the trust, and yet the bonuses remained. Why, you ask? Well, here's the decision by CBC wisdom to lower the key standards from a year ago so they could justify the rich bonuses. Only the CBC executives would huddle up and determine everything going down, but we got to protect our bonuses, and they agreed to this. And guess what, Madam Speaker? The Liberals bought in. They bought into this, agreeing to $18 million on the top-up. Do you know, since 2018, the CBC viewership has collapsed nearly 50%. They have failed to meet 79% of their key performance targets. Did I mention it was the same executives that got these bonuses were the ones that were responsible a little over a year ago in cutting 800 jobs. These cuts amounted to about 10% of the entire workforce of CBC Radio Canada. The federal government, as we know, compensates CBC. They give them about $1.3 billion a year. So the public broadcaster, to me, has a head start over the private broadcasters already in this country. But it doesn't stop there. It's even worse, believe it or not. The CBC was given millions in last year's fall economic statement. 21 million gift dollars from last year, and guess what? Another 21 million this year. On top of that, they generate about $400 million in ads, even though, as I've just talked about, the ad revenue is going down. So Canadians need to understand that their government is choosing to give more than $1.3 billion to a company that already makes $400 million in advertising, and Canadians are tired that their money is being spent on bonuses for absolutely dismal performances. Canada CEO in our committee at the Canadian Heritage. Hundreds wrote in to us, and others then took to social media, expressing their dismay about the arrogance and the entitlement at a time when so many are hurting in this country. It's astonishing. One person said, these elites live in their own bubble, protected from us by their entitlements and their social status. They simply do not care what we think, and then they're shocked that would we even speak up against them. It is time to clean up this corrupt federal bureaucracy that the Liberals have built. Broadcasters need to have accountability, fairness for people who have trust in them. Now, can Canadians possibly have faith? How can they have possibly any faith in this institution that rewards their executives by cutting hundreds of jobs in the last year? Canadians are tired of seeing their taxpayer funds mismanaged by this Prime Minister and his cabinet. No wonder nobody trusts this government anymore with their money. The Liberals fail to see that Canadians are struggling in every aspect of their lives. And the response is, well, we'll give $18 million to the CBC for their corporate buddies, at a time when record numbers of Canadians are heading to the food banks. And even in my city of Saskatoon, there was an outcry yesterday by the Saskatoon Food Bank. They're asking the public now for help as they are running out of the most essential items that they can give out. The Saskatoon 40% increase since 2019. So 5 short years, we've seen a 40% increase. Yet the CEO of CBC Radio Canada believes it is appropriate to ask for millions of dollars in it's arrogance and it's absolutely tone deafness. CBC was failing to deliver all all along on their key performance indicators. So you know what? They just changed the indicators. They lowered them from the year before. And they thought nobody would notice. Well, we notice, and obviously, Madam Speaker, Canadians have noticed. This government has no remorse, giving out massive amounts of money, and the government simply hands it out, no questions asked. Handing money over to the public rather than support health stream. The telcos and CBC, the public broadcaster, took it over. They thought they were going to get mass amounts of millions of dollars. Well, it ended up Google said, we'll give you under 100 million, you can disperse it, but there we go again. CBC with their hands out, they were right there. This Liberal government is absolutely out of touch, and CBC is out of touch, which leads me to talk about the CEO, Catherine Tate. She was appointed by this government in 2018. Since taking over, viewership, as I mentioned, has been cut in half. What worries me now over this is Catherine Tate has not had a bonus in 2022-23 or 20.
A telephone that's vibrating. I don't know if it's on the member's desk. We're going to remind, we did it yesterday. I want to remind members to please not have their phones on their desk unless, or members who are next to them, because the mics are on. It does interfere with the interpreters, and it would be great if that could be respected. The honourable member for Saskatoon Grasswood has 30 seconds.
So what really worries me, Madam Speaker, as Ms. Tate has less than 3 months left as CEO of CBC, she hasn't taken any bonus in the last 2 years. Here's my prediction. She will bolt from the position in January, take 2.5 years of bonuses, we'll never hear from her again. And the public needs to have a response. Yeah. You know what, Madam Speaker? Conservatives are right on this. As common sense Conservatives, we will clean up this mess created by the Heritage Minister and this Liberal government. Call the carbon tax election now.
Hear, hear.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Speaker, I think they're running out of speakers on the matter of privilege. You know, we've had, what, about 100 plus Conservatives stand up on the privilege issue, and because they're running a little shy in terms of things to say, possibly, something new, we haven't heard that for weeks, Madam Speaker, now they stand up and they introduce a concurrence motion as opposed to having to debate the privilege motion, Madam Speaker. I guess the question I have for the member opposite is the Conservative Party that desperate to find speakers to deal with the privilege issue that now they have to bring in concurrence motions in order to filibuster their filibuster, which has an amendment to a motion in which they actually support but refuse to allow to come to a vote? How silly is this?
The honourable member Saskatoon Grasswood.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. The issue is the CBC bonuses. Why can't I know you don't want to talk about the bonuses. I know he doesn't want to talk about it because they paid out $18 million. They've given CBC $1.3 billion. This has been a cash cow for this Minister of Canadian Heritage and the Privy Council. That's why they don't want to talk about it. They know Canadians are upset. They're lined up at the food bank every day, and yet $73,000 going to government.
To be fair, I think
To Ms. Cumming.
The honourable member. I'd like to thank my colleague. I'd like to hear from him on the topic of culture. We know that there are great differences within CBC Radio-Canada. We know that within Francophone culture, we know that Radio-Canada brings in a great deal of advertising revenue, but that's not the case for CBC. And yet the cuts were 50-50, split between Anglophones and Francophones. Does he not feel that there's a real disparity here that the government should have addressed much more convincingly?
Deputy to Saskatoon Grasswood.
I want to thank my bloc member. He's absolutely correct. CBC Radio Canada is a very good institution. They've done very good work in this country, and especially in the province of Quebec. Yet when they started cutting the 800 employees with CBC, the first place they looked was the province of Quebec and CBC Radio Canada. Yep. The most successful out of the operation of CBC is CBC Radio Canada. So where do you start? Well, they started there instead of talking about television. They don't measure up at all in Western Canada in television. This government and this CEO is out of touch. We can't wait to correct their mistakes.
Here, here. Bravo.
Dr. Windsor West.
One thing I am concerned, though, is the Conservatives continue to talk about defunding the CBC. So I agree with reining in the management and the fees and the bonuses for sure. That should have been done a long time ago under several governments. But when you look at Marketplace and Go Public, there's issues over Rogers, Air Canada, Porter, most recently with persons with disabilities, McDonald's, E. coli, landlord tactics using artificial intelligence against consumers, sex trafficking by CEOs from Abercrombie and Finch and Nygaard, Honda with regards to the fuel pump issues, Elon Musk over Tesla and their issues, Boeing, for example, in public safety, allowing the X platform, former Twitter, to use artificial intelligence against people, and tobacco giants and emission scandals and car companies. It goes on and on. I guess my point, my question to my friend here is, we are going to lose significant investigative reporting that protects Canadian consumers. When they defund the CBC, what are they going to do next?
The honourable member for Saskatoon-Grasswood has 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Thanks to the member of Windsor, we've worked together on several private member bills in this House of Commons, but the topic here is these bonuses. $18 million handed out last year when the corporation cut over 800 jobs. I mean, how arrogant. I watched an interview with CEO Catherine Tate did with Arsenault on CBC, and, you know, it was astonishing that the CBC CEO had little remorse for the 800 jobs leaving, but boy, did she want to fill her pockets and her executive table, which she has done in the last year.
Resuming debate, the honourable for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And as always, it is an honour to be able to stand in my place to represent the good people of Battle River Crowfoot, and in particular talk about something that is gaining momentum. And that is the conversation surrounding the mismanagement, the abuse of tax dollars, and the unbelievable revelations that $18 million in bonuses were paid out to managers and executives at CBC, even when that organization decided that it would cut frontline workers right before Christmas. So the 8th report of the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage addressed this very thing and reported back in to this House that it was, and I'll read the motion that we're debating here today because I believe the parliamentary secretary on the other side somewhat acknowledged actually that Conservatives are far better at getting stuff accomplished than the government is, I think is what he was admitting by his previous question. But the motion that we are debating here today is that given the job cuts announced at CBC Radio Canada for the year 2024, it would be inappropriate for the CBC to grant bonuses to executive members. So, Madam Speaker, it is a very simple and straightforward motion and cuts to the heart of where we are seeing the mismanagement at CBC. And certainly when it comes to the issue at hand, when you have a well-placed Liberal appointees getting rich off of tax dollars, and when it comes to the egregious example where job cuts announced just before Christmas, there was the current president of CBC came out, begged for more money, saying there'd be more job cuts if they couldn't get more cash from the government. Yet, unbelievably, they, at that same time, were going through the process of approving $18 million in bonuses, including, although we don't have the specifics because the CEO and the president and CEO of CBC Canada refuses to disclose what both her bonus package was proposed to be, and just like at committee the other week, she refused to tell Canadians what her severance package would be, and she refused further to rule out accepting a severance as her term as the president and CEO of CBC comes to an end. You see that they begged for more money, handed out big bonuses, and yet have the audacity to lay frontline workers off. It is that sort of arrogance, that sort of the attitude that has, by the CEO of CBC, Catherine Tate, her own admission, that the defund argument has gained momentum. Now, maybe she didn't understand the ATIP process, but, and for many Canadians who I'm sure are watching this very important debate, any Canadian can ask for information from government. It's through what's called an access to information request. There's a simple form online, and I believe it costs you $5. It's a simple administrative fee. You can ask for information. So in this case, a reporter asked for information about whether or not the CEO of CBC, and it's really virtually unlimited as long as it doesn't have to do with issues of privacy or national security, and there's a few other areas that are exempted from that. But a reporter had asked for information about for communications that the CEO of CBC would have had about the conversations around defunding. And in those emails, it was revealed that the CEO admitted that there was momentum growing to defund CBC television. And certainly when she was confronted with her own words at committee this past week, it was quite interesting to see her response. Instead of acknowledging what she said in a private email, she continued to defend her failed record and that of this Liberal government to the tune of $1.3 billion in subsidies each and every year, millions of dollars in bonuses, a falling ad revenue requiring more taxpayer subsidy. At the same time, you have fewer and fewer Canadians are watching CBC television. And Madam Speaker, I would just note, it's interesting because there was this number thrown around at the Heritage Committee, and the CBC talks about 20 million people interacting with their services. Well, any person in this place that has a Facebook page and different social media presence, a website, and of course we all have the content that ends up online through Parleview and other channels. Some of us in this place, in fact, it doesn't take that big of a social media following to have multiple million views over the course of a month, yet the CBC is bragging that they have that 20 million touch points for Canadians, which includes some of the most expensive broadcasting infrastructure in the history of the country, yet there are those in this place, by comparison, that probably have similar reach to some of their content, yet it is done at a far, far less expensive way. So you see increasingly, and my colleague earlier made mention about the key performance indicators, KPIs. Now, most folks, when they hear an acronym like KPI, it doesn't necessarily resonate. But what we found very interesting is that when the last fiscal year, so 22-23, the last full fiscal year prior to the one that we just completed, there was the key performance indicators of CBC. They fulfilled, I believe it was 3 of 14. 3 of 14 key performance indicators that were the metrics that CBC itself said would determine that it was successful in fulfilling its mandate. So it's a little bit like the student grading their own paper, and even they admitted that they were failing at doing so. But when it comes to what I would suggest would be common sense, is that when you're failing, you make changes. Well, they did make a change, and I'll admit that. But the change was not to improve what they're doing. It was to change the way that they evaluate how they're doing. So, Madam Speaker, we have a circumstance where the student was grading their own paper, and they acknowledged that they failed the first go-around, but instead of making changes to ensure that they stop failing in the future, they simply changed the metric to which they evaluated their poor performance in the past. And the result of that comes back to this. It comes back to cash. Cash in the pockets of executives. To the tune, Madam Speaker, if you can believe this, to the average executive, of which there are 43, and when I saw 43 executives, I thought that must be a typo. 43 executives at the public broadcaster? Like, give me a break. However, when it comes to the average of the bonus, $71,000 average for the bonus of each executive, to the tune of more than $3 million. Madam Speaker, at a time when Canadians are hurting, Food bank usage has reached historic levels. Home prices have doubled. The cost of everything is becoming unaffordable for regular Canadians. And the average Canadian makes less than what a CBC executive would have received in a bonus. How out of touch is that? And then to add insult to injury, they also told the president and CEO, those executives, and the managers that received bonuses went to frontline staff at CBC before Christmas, nonetheless, and said, I'm sorry, your effort here isn't appreciated. I keep my job and my bonus, you lose yours. Go home and tell your family that. The arrogance is astounding. The mismanagement is such a reflection of what we see in the benches of this Liberal cabinet, where they would take for themselves, but literally put out on the street, hardworking men and women, those who actually do the work, while those who claim to make the decisions get rich. So after 9 years, Madam Speaker, we have seen that a failing performance virtually across the spectrum at CBC, lower ad revenue, lower viewers. In fact, the number of viewers that CBC gets is they're going to have to start changing the key performance indicator for that if they're even able to report it. And we see increasingly that Canadians are simply not wanting to watch the content that CBC is producing. That's the simple fact of the matter. So when it comes down to it, it's time for common sense. It is time to defund the CBC and ensure that bonuses are not paid out to rich executives at the same time that they are cutting frontline workers. Now, we get very political in this place, and we're politicians in a parliament. I conclude with this by saying, I hope that we can find unity in this place about canceling the bonuses for executives when frontline workers saw their jobs cut.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Madam Speaker, I'll get the opportunity to address the Chamber on a wide variety of issues reflecting on CBC, but the specific question I have for the member is a shell shock moment for the member from Lethbridge when she was questioned in regards to CBC radio and really not necessarily knowing what to say, came back with the response, well, I kind of support the leader of the Conservative Party. And we're a little unclear. Can the member opposite provide a 100% guarantee that the Conservatives will not touch CBC radio? Will he provide that commitment now?
Mr. Crowfoot.
You know what's interesting, Madam Speaker, is over the last number of days we've seen chaos in the Liberal ranks. So I see, I believe there's 152, although it's quickly diminishing because they keep losing these by-elections. And more MPs seem to be resigning all the time, announcing that they won't be running again and whatnot. But, Madam Speaker, I think there's a very, very interesting question that Parliamentary Secretary needs to answer. Was his name one of the 24 that have called for his boss to take a hike, to take a walk in the snow, a walk in the sand, whatever kind of walk it is, to walk out of the doors of this place so that we can restore some ability back to the institution that is Canada's Parliament, as opposed to a guy that seems to care about nothing more than power and the perks that come along with it. Madam Speaker, when it comes to the questions that Canadians want answers to, was that member one of the 24 to telling his boss to go take a hike?
Questions.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte. Thank you, Madam Speaker. While significant cuts are being made that affects many workers, many cuts, especially in French, it's a cultural disaster. But at the same time, we hear that bonuses have been made, and that's what I heard. I heard a number which I find rather shocking. I'm not sure that I heard the number. What was the average bonus given? Because it seemed shocking.
Député de Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And so there's a a number of numbers there, so I'll unpack them very, very quickly. One, there was $18 million in bonuses total paid out to executives, managers, and out-of-scope non-unionized employees. However, when it comes to the specifics around the executives, the average of $71,000 for the 73 executives at CBC. And certainly when it comes to, as that member mentioned, the Liberals like to accuse other parties of being the ones to make cuts, yet it's them that are cutting French language reporting. It is the Liberals that are making cuts that are devastating cultural organizations across this country. So when it comes to the numbers, those are the numbers. About $3.1 million went to executives. Those 43 executives, the average was about $71,000 each. But, Madam Speaker, these Liberals would far prefer to make cuts to frontline employees and pay out their rich friends. That, Madam Speaker, is shameful.
Questions and comments? The Honourable for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you. Well, we have yet another day of a full-on attack of the independents on Canadian media. We saw the Conservative leader attack Global. We saw him attack Canadian Press. We saw him go after the Toronto Star, the vicious attack on CTV, and, of course, the CBC. But all this is happening as questions are being raised about why that member cannot get security clearance. And there's an article from October 23rd, this past week, in the Globe and Mail, where the member for Wellington Halton Hills explains. He says, security checks involve a rigorous process that includes checks on family members, credit and criminal checks, and questions about one's sexual partners or wherever they have used drugs. That is not a reason that a man can hide from getting a security clearance so that we don't find out whether or not his family had been involved in criminal activities. And yet the member for Wellington Halton Hills goes on to say that the Prime Minister should reach out and just tell the member for Stornoway so he doesn't have a simple question. What is it that the Conservatives are so afraid of exposing in the member for Stornoway's background?
The Honourable for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I find it interesting that that member has such great trust and admiration for that Prime Minister. But here's the reality. That Prime Minister doesn't actually have security clearance. That Prime Minister has security clearance by nature of the position. He did not grant himself that security clearance. It is by the nature of the position that he holds that he has it. He could, and that Prime Minister is able to declassify the information, release the 11 names. Conservatives have made it very, very clear that we want that information made public so that Canadians can know. So when it comes to the cheap shots that member makes often in this place, Madam Speaker, I would simply conclude by saying this. Release the names so that Canadians can make the choice as opposed to playing politics like that Prime Minister and the soon-to-be former member from Timmins James Bay is doing.
So I just want to remind members they've had an opportunity to ask a question. They should wait for the answer, even though they may not like the answer. If they have other questions and comments, they should wait till the appropriate time. Same thing for those who are not being recognized and are making comments. I would ask them to wait for the appropriate time to do so. Resuming debate, reprise de débat. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary at the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, I put it in the form of a question earlier, but I think it's something that's really people need to take a note of. The silliness of the Conservative Party today under the leadership of what I would suggest to you is a conservative reformer, Madam Speaker, that is heavily influenced by the far right. I tell you, it's incredible in terms of the degree in which they want to filibuster. Let's think about what it is that they're proposing today now. First and foremost, weeks ago, on the issue of a privilege, they moved a motion saying that we want an issue to go to Procedures and House Affairs Committee. Now, after moving that motion, Madam Speaker, we quickly found out that all members of the House were actually in favor of the motion actually going to Procedures and House Affairs Committee. Conservatives, on the other hand, kind of flip-flop a little bit, and they say, well, no, we want to have some speakers on the motion. And then they bring in an amendment to the motion, and they put up dozens of speakers. And then they bring up an amendment to the motion, and they put up dozens of more speakers. All in an attempt not to deal with the issue, but all in an attempt to frustrate the House of Commons. Why? Because the leader of the Conservative Party is more concerned about the Conservative Party than Canadians and the issues that we're having to face. Denying a litany of important pieces of legislation and other types of debate, dealing with everything from online harms to children to courts, converting from military to civilian courts, dealing with issues such as citizenship, and so much more. But the Conservatives are more interested in themselves and foregoing what's in the interests of Canadians, Madam Speaker. Now today, they bring in a motion of concurrence in order to be able to filibuster their original filibuster in terms of an issue going to Procedures and House Affairs Committee. I find to the degree in which they are more focused on themselves. What I find interesting is there's a lot of reports that are out there, Madam Speaker. There's a lot of reports. We're talking 100 plus of reports that they could call on. Which issue do they decide to pull out to contribute to their filibuster? CBC. Well, there's nothing new there in the sense that the Conservative Party, especially under this leadership, has no time at all for CBC and CTV. This is a leader that has no respect for either of those two media outlets, Madam Speaker. I suspect it's because maybe they don't like it when their behavior and their actions are reflected in the national news. They rather rely on misinformation, fake news, social media, and the million-plus email data bank that they have, Madam Speaker. That's what they rely on. They want to take a page out of out of the U.S. politics and spread massive amounts of misinformation. That's how they believe that they're going to be successful. The more uninformed Canadians are, the greater likelihood of them being successful. The more they can promote hatred towards politicians, the more that they will be successful. And that's the reason why today they want to talk about CBC. Is it interesting, the member from Timmins actually raised the issue that I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about. Because I do believe there's a personal vendetta that we're seeing with the Conservative Party. They have a hatred for CBC, well-known, well-established, Madam Speaker. Take a look at some of the things that they have been reporting on. And I believe, Madam Speaker, that's where you'll find why it is that they wanted to talk about CBC today. Because they have their sights on getting rid of CBC because CBC is informing Canadians in terms of what's happening in a very real sense. For the last couple days, I don't know how many questions, how many times I have challenged, it's been a lot, dozens of times, many members of the Conservative Party on the issue of foreign interference, Madam Speaker. I've consistently asked questions in regards to foreign interference, because the answers that the Conservatives are giving is completely unrelated to the truth. And Madam Speaker, interesting enough, CBC had a report on it. And I want to share what it is, some of the things that CBC is actually saying. And I would ask members to make the connection as to, is there any surprise why the Conservative Party of Canada, headed by their extreme right leader, Madam Speaker, has no time and wants to get rid of CBC? This is the reason why we're seeing that, Madam Speaker. Here's a report that came out on CBC. They can check. I think the headline was, why won't the PM release names, and why won't the leader of the Conservative Party get a security clearance? That's the headline, Madam Speaker, on the CBC report. I'm going to read some of the details to it. But realize this, Madam Speaker. The issue is very, very serious. In fact, Madam Speaker, I would suggest to you, interesting, I actually had 2 reports on CBC, from CBC, and let me go with the first one here, Madam Speaker. Foreign interference. How much that has been raised inside the House. Canadians are genuinely concerned about foreign interference, whether it's of a highly political nature or it's in our communities. Yesterday I made reference to assassinations. I made reference to extortion that's taking place. There's a number of countries that we continue to look at, Madam Speaker. It's not just one country. It's a serious issue. Here's an example that was on CBC not that long ago. And it's in reference to a website that has actually been frozen. I believe it's from the FBI. And the article reads, Madam Speaker, a website at the heart of international Russian disinformation operation has produced more than a dozen articles about Canadian politics in an apparent attempt to undermine support for the Prime Minister of Canada and boost his chief rival, the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, Madam Speaker. The website, Reliable Recent News, has been identified by officials in Europe and in the U.S. as a repository for pro-Kremlin articles. This is pro-Russia trying to influence what people are thinking here in Canada, Madam Speaker. This is something that CBC reported on. The Conservatives don't like that, of course, because there are a lot of people that watch CBC, Madam Speaker, because they have confidence and trust in CBC. So why is it that the Conservatives are so much aligned to get rid of CBC? Well, let's go fast forward it. Remember the issue, foreign interference. We have a leader, one leader in the House of Commons that is putting his party's interest and himself ahead of the nation. And that is the leader of the Conservative Party. The leader of the Green, NDP, and Bloc have all received the security clearance, Madam Speaker, and the Prime Minister, obviously. All of them have received it. The only one that refuses to get it is the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. And he says, well, if I get it, I will be not able to speak about the issues. That's one of the concerns that he actually raises, Madam Speaker. We all know that that's not true, but that's what the Conservative, in their attempt to justify why the Conservatives are putting their party ahead of the nation's interests, that's the only thing that they can come up with, even though it's not true, Madam Speaker. The misinformation on this issue is significant. Look at the social media, whether it's from the leader of the Conservative Party or other members of the Conservative Party, and you will find that they continuously, intentionally are misleading through social media and emails, Madam Speaker. So here now you get it as one of Canada's most trusted media outlets, and what is actually said? What was actually reported? And again, this isn't CBC saying it. This is CBC reporting it. Who are their sources? Well, former CSIS directors, individuals that are in the know, Madam Speaker. They understand the issues. They're professionals. They're people in which we should all be respecting, Madam Speaker. When you talk about CSIS directors or you talk about our RCMP, these are institutions that should in fact be respected, not thrown to the side in favor of Conservative propaganda. In the past, leader of the Conservative Party has defended his decision not to receive a national security clearance and get briefed by intelligence agencies by arguing that it would prevent him from speaking freely and criticizing the government on foreign interference issues. That's their argument. So they state. Fadden and then we're talking about Richard Fadden here, Madam Speaker, he's the former CSIS director, said, and I quote, "That wouldn't be the case." Quote, "Just because you have a security clearance doesn't mean you have to become a monk and never speak," he said. He also said that the leader of the Conservative Party could choose to be briefed only on issues affecting his own party if he wanted to create a buffer ensuring he could criticize the government on foreign interference. In his statement on Wednesday, the leader of the Conservative Party said, well, his chief of staff has received classified briefings. And again, quote, "At no time has the government told me or my chief of staff of any current or former Conservative parliamentarian or candidate knowingly participating in foreign interference." So says the leader of the Conservative Party because he refuses to get the security clearance. It's responded. Ellick says that CSIS would not brief a chief of staff on foreign interference issues pertaining to individual parliamentarians. Quote, "What could the chief of staff do with the information?" Ellick said. Mr., referring to the leader of the Conservative Party, doesn't have a clearance. So the chief of staff can't tell him the information. And the chief of staff has no power to do anything about MPs or make decisions about MPs because he's not the leader of the party. During the inquiry hearing on Wednesday, lawyer Nando De Luca, acting for the Conservative Party, argued that CSIS could use something called a threat to reduction measures to inform the leader.
Sorry, I have a point of order.
The honourable member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagot. Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. The subject of foreign interference is very important, but I'm looking for the link with CBC.
Okay. On sait que
We know that a lot of latitude is given to members in discussions, but certainly we would ask that the points that are being raised during debate have some relevancy to the debate. So I'm certain that the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary will ensure that he mentions the mention that is before the House and that he will raise in his speech certain aspects of that. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, just so that if there are members that are coming in somewhat late and didn't hear the beginning, we're talking about the CBC.
The honourable member knows that he's not to mention whether someone has been or is in the chamber or anything like that. Is he speaking now on the point of order, or is he speaking? Okay, so I think I made it very clear on the point of order. I'll allow the honourable to add if he needs to, but at the end of the day, I think that, as I've indicated, the honourable member can go on with his speech, and I'm sure that he will ensure that he is referencing the motion that's before the House. On the point of order, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, on the point of order, just in make it related to why it is that the Conservatives are bringing in this particular concurrence report is because they don't like what CBC is saying, and that's why I'm conveying to the House what it is that CBC reported.
As I've indicated, there is some latitude. We recognize that, and I'm sure that the honourable member will continue to ensure that his speech is relevant to the discussion. And so, the honourable parliamentary secretary.
Yes, Madam Speaker, and and the report goes on. And again, this isn't the views of CBC. If you read the entire story, you will see that there is fair criticism all across the board. But it points out facts. And it points out where there is a great deal of misinformation. And that misinformation is ultimately what it is that the Conservatives are thriving on, Madam Speaker. And that's ultimately the reason why we find today an attack once again on CBC. It could go on. Fadden said those threats to reduction measures are meant to inform politicians when they may themselves be targeted and wouldn't be used to share classified information with the leader of the party, of a party. Interesting enough, it goes on here. You can't give classified information to people if they don't have the security clearance. Can you muck around on the margins and try to get people to think differently? Question mark. Yes, but that's not what we're talking about, he said. This is an expert, Madam Speaker. The leader of the Conservative Party and the Conservatives have been calling on the Prime Minister to release the names of allegedly compromised parliamentarians. They repeated that demand on Wednesday. How many times have we heard that demand here, Madam Speaker, in the form of formal speeches and through heckling? We hear it constantly. Here's what the professionals have to say, Madam Speaker. But law enforcement and national security agencies have been clear on this point. Sharing any classified information is a crime. So what is the professionals saying, Madam Speaker? The individuals that are in the know, they're saying, and I quote again, but law enforcement and national security agencies have been clear on this point. Sharing any classified information is a crime. So every time we hear Conservatives say, tell us the 11 names, tell us the 11 names, number one, I don't know the 11 names, Madam Speaker. But if I did know the 11 names, it would be a crime. Anyone who reveals, and again I go back to the story, anyone who reveals classified information is subject to the law equally, and obviously in this case those names are classified at this time, and to reveal them publicly would be a criminal offense. RCMP Deputy Commissioner Mark Flynn told MPs on the Public Accounts Committee in June, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I am very much disappointed. If you give me a 1-minute warning, I'd appreciate it. Disappointed in terms of how it is the Conservative Party has played a very strong destructive force. I remind them that they also have an obligation as they focus their attention purely on what's in the best interest of the leader of the Conservative Party and the Conservative Party. We will continue to remain focused on Canadians and the interest in providing the programs and the supports and supporting our economy, knowing full well that if we build on our infrastructure, if we support Canada's middle class, if we encourage an economy that works for all Canadians, and we're starting to see the signs of that, Madam Speaker, when you get interest rates coming down, inflation rate finally under control and on target, Madam Speaker. The creation of jobs. Hope is there, Madam Speaker. 2025 is going to be a good year for Canadians. We will, Madam Speaker, continue to work for Canadians first and foremost. That is the right thing to do. As opposed to looking at ways to filibuster, and that's what today's CBC motion is all about, Madam Speaker. It's not about the issue. They're using it as a mechanism in order to prevent the House of Commons from being able to have the types of debates, to pass the legislation, to look at issues that are affecting Canadians on a day-in, day-out basis. And no matter how obstructive they are, I can assure members opposite that this Prime Minister, that this government will continue to be focused on Canadians. Having said that, Madam Speaker, I do have an amendment. So, Madam Speaker, I would move, seconded by the member from Humber River Black Creek, that the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the word that and substituting with the following. The 8th report of the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage presented on Tuesday, December 12, 2023 be not now concurred in, but that it be recommitted to the Standing Committee on Heritage for further consideration, provided that it be an instruction to the committee to study the consequences of defunding CBC and Radio Canada, including the effects on smaller communities as promised by the leader of the official opposition. This is a good motion. You should support it. And seconded, yes. I gave a lot of thought. And forth. There's no shortage of people.
Un appel au règlement avant que j'aille sur la motion.
Point of order before proceeding on the motion.
Une seconde, j'ai pas le micro de dessus. J'ai un rappel au règlement.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. The honourable member for Drummond. Thank you. I just want to ensure that the French version is on its way.
Ils n'ont pas besoin d'un. Ouais, la version française, elle va venir.
Yes, it is coming. It is definitely coming, but I will be reading the motion as tabled meanwhile, and we will go to questions and comments.
L'honorable député de Drummond, un autre rappel au règlement.
Another point of order. Madam Speaker, before moving forward, I would like to see the French version of the amendment. Well, it will also be interpreted simultaneously, so I will just advise the member that when a member reads the motion, it doesn't necessarily need to be in both languages because we have interpretation. However, the motion will ultimately be translated in written form.
Monsieur Lamoureux, seconded by Ms. Scrow, Ms. Scrow, moves that the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the word that and substituting the following. The 8th report of the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage presented on Tuesday, December the 12th, 2023, be not now concurred in, but that it be recommitted to the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage for further consideration, provided that it be an instruction to the committee to study the consequences of defunding the CBC and Radio-Canada, including the effects on smaller communities as promised by the Leader of the Official Opposition. The motion is in order. Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member, question, on continue comme si ça rien. The honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I listened to yet another speech from the member from Winnipeg North, and you know, if he was here in the previous speeches where some of my Conservative colleagues were talking about the KPIs of the CBC and the way that the CBC executives had actually reduced the KPIs in order so that they could still achieve their goals and therefore get these incredible bonuses that we've been talking about today. And you know, I think my colleagues did a great job of explaining how that's a level of incompetence that Canadians are very concerned about at the CBC. But my question for the member is, how could the Liberal government stand by and watch this happen? How could they watch the management of this organization lower their standards to achieve their bonuses and not say something? And I'd just like to understand how this government actually operates with such incompetence and such disregard for the obvious management principles of an organization.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
So thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, first of all, I would indicate that the discussion that we're having today was only occurring because the Conservatives wanted to do a little bit of ongoing playing of games through a filibuster of their original motion. In regards to the specific question, I think it's important to note the amendment that I brought forward. So if the Conservatives are genuinely concerned...
Rappel au règlement, l'honorable...
Point of order. The Honourable Member for La Salle, Aymar Verdun. I am new here, and I wanted to ask whether we can question people's motives in this way. Could you please repeat that question? I'm asking whether we can question people's motives in this way when we take the floor in this House.
Asséner un procès d'intention à l'opposition officielle, juste...
I'm curious about what this appeal to motive coming from the Conservative opposition. I'm curious about whether it's allowed in this House. Could the member elaborate, please? Well, what I'm talking about is a case where people presume to know other people's motives when they actually don't. I wanted to know whether that is allowed in this House, because I know that in other parliamentary assemblies it is not allowed. So I wanted to know whether this rhetorical, this fallacy ultimately is allowed.
C'est certain que pendant les débats, il y a...
Well, I can say for sure that during debate, different positions may be brought forward. We do ask members not to necessarily presume to know the motives of other members. But this is sometimes that we hear in the House from time to time. I hope that I have properly understood what the member is trying to say. But yes, from time to time, messages are passed around to the House to clarify certain things, during debate. We do see that regularly. Just a second, please. But this is becoming a point of debate. But the honourable member...
Une fois qu'il est debout, si l'honorable...
And I would just ask the member to rise and wait for the microphone light to go on, because otherwise I won't hear the beginning of what he says. So the honourable member for La Salle Aymar Verdun. I'd like to thank the speaker for what she said, and I'm sorry that I was standing while she was speaking. And I'd like to apologize to my colleague for Winnipeg North for having interrupted his fascinating speech.
Alors, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary is in the process of answering the question from the Honourable Member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and the interruption's okay, not to worry. Madam Speaker, if you take a look at the amendment that we've proposed, I believe the Conservatives should have a little bit of hope through that amendment. That here what we're saying is let's give it to the committee, and let's talk about what the Conservative agenda is on the issue of CBC, Madam Speaker. I see that as a positive thing. I trust that members of the Conservative Party, along with other members, will in fact support this well-thought-out amendment. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? L'honorable député de Drummond.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
The honourable member for Drummond. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I know that the Conservatives have a tendency to demonize CBC. Ever since I arrived here in 2019, that's basically all they do. Well, fine, that's their position. But that said, amid the flood of misinformation that we get from our Conservative friends on CBC, there are certain things we should pay attention to. There are some things that may contain a grain of truth, and because of the Liberals' defensive posture, it's very hard to find a nuanced middle ground and to pay attention to the issues that we actually should find worthy of being debated. I am concerned about the bonuses of Ms. Tate, and I'm concerned about the context. I would like us to discuss that context, and I would like to discuss how remuneration is determined at CBC. I would like to hear about the expectations we have about these matters and others, and I would like to hear from my colleague for Winnipeg North to hear if he has concerns about the current payment structure at CBC Radio-Canada and whether his government agrees that we should look at this and try to ensure that we find appropriate ways to pay people working at CBC.
Parlementaire?
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the question, and I do look for ways in which we can improve upon the system. CBC Radio Canada is such a critical part of our identity. It's one of the things that highlights the uniqueness of the province of Quebec, as an example, Madam Speaker. And at the end of the day, having a dialogue and talking about how it is that we can make, whether it's CBC TV or CBC Radio, be more efficient and answer the needs into the future, I'm all open to that. And that's why I think that this is a good amendment, and hopefully we'll be able to get members from the bloc also supporting it.
Questions and comments? The honourable for Courtney Alberni.
We know the Conservatives put forward this motion, and we support ending bonuses to CEOs, something that we opposed when the Harper government did the same thing at CBC. But at a time when workers are losing their jobs, the Conservatives had an opportunity to put forward a motion to return those bonuses to workers instead. But we know that their goal is actually to defund, not just defund the CBC, but to actually eliminate the CBC. Susan McVitie wrote on my Facebook page the other day, she wrote, quote, "CBC Radio is desperately needed in rural Canada. It gives a voice to local news, our community events and issues, our musicians, and talk shows, the very fabric that binds us together as Canadians. Publicly owned, not-for-profit, and proudly Canadian-owned by Canadians for Canada." Maybe more people could start questioning government oil and gas subsidies, etc., instead of supporting the erasing of Canadian content. Well, we know, Madam Speaker, the Conservatives are never going to go after the subsidies for oil and gas, and the Liberals too, Madam Speaker. And so maybe my question through you is, will the government make sure that they're also going to look at going after oil and gas subsidies and making sure that they continue to provide stable, long-term funding to the CBC?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, first and foremost, with the support and help of the NDP, we were able to eliminate those oil subsidies that the member's making reference to, and I would think that would be a good thing. You know, we can accomplish some great things when the NDP and Liberals work together as in a progressive nature. CBC, I can tell you, from day one of being a parliamentarian, Liberals have consistently supported CBC. At best, the Conservatives kind of flip-flop depending on the leader of the Conservative Party. Sometimes they're quiet, sometimes they're vocal. Under this far-right Conservative leader, they want to get rid of CBC. Let there be no doubt, if this Conservative leader becomes the Prime Minister, CBC is gone.
Chers commentaires, l'honorable ministre de l'Environnement et du Changement climatique.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Thank you. As you may know, I've done interviews for CBC Radio-Canada throughout the country. And something we see throughout the country is that the Francophone and Anglophone sides are very intimately linked. If we were to abolish CBC as the Conservative Party wants, what would that mean for the Francophone section? Yes, of course, within Quebec, but especially outside Quebec. The Conservatives are trying to tell us that there would be no issue, that Radio-Canada could continue easily. But I'd like to hear from our colleague from Winnipeg North what the consequences would be.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, the Minister raises an excellent point. Think in terms of Canadian heritage. And a part of our heritage is our language. French language, English language, in particular French language, and the impact that the Conservatives would have on French language, not only in the province of Quebec, but especially in other regions of Canada, would be profoundly negative under the current leader of the Conservative Party, Madam Speaker. So many communities, I think of in Winnipeg alone, St. Boniface, Manitoba, you can talk about St. Pierre, Jolie, and so many other communities across Canada benefit because the way in which CBC is integrated and has that bilingual, what I would classify as a bilingual factor. It is a part of our identity and our heritage. And that's why it's so important that Canadians understand that under the Conservative Party, CBC will be gone. The best way to protect CBC is to ensure that the Conservatives do not form government.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and to my honourable friend, the Parliamentary Secretary. I'm interested in raising a point because there's a certain irony here. So I should put on the record the Green Party supports the CBC, wants to see a commercial-free news and public affairs function for CBC Television et aussi pour Radio-Canada, juste de même pour radio, pour les émissions. The Conservative stance, which appears to be that they want an election platform to get rid of CBC, but are currently one of the biggest advertisers on CBC. And maybe in this debate, we can find out how much money the Conservative Party is spending. I certainly enjoy seeing the leader of the official opposition and his wife doing what most Canadians do on weekends, striding across a field in hope of finding an empty flagpole in which they can pull the Canadian flag out and hoist it. It's a wonderful family moment that we always enjoy. But I'm wondering how much money the Conservative Party is now spending on advertising outside the writ period. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Yes, Madam Speaker, there's been a suggestion that I might want to amend the motion. Maybe this would be a good discussion point once it gets to committee. And I appreciate, whether it's the Greens, the NDP, and the Bloc, I like to think that progressive parties understand and appreciate the value of CBC. And yes, it is somewhat ironic, Madam Speaker, that you would have the Conservative Party saying we're going to get rid of the CBC if elected in government. On the other hand, they advertise on it. The reason why they're advertising on it, Madam Speaker, is because they know that there's a lot of people that follow and have a lot of respect for CBC. So there seems to be a bit of a contradiction there, Madam Speaker, but the reality is that for the Conservative Party, not only is it CBC that they've been highly critical of, they've also been highly critical of CTV. Any sort of mainstream, strong, healthy media outlet, they tend to shy away from in favor of social media and the far right of misinformation.
Reprise de débat, l'honorable député de Drummond.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Drummond. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I must confess that I would have liked to keep hearing the answers from the member for Winnipeg North because he is defending our public broadcaster. And so am I. I think we need a healthy, neutral, reliable public broadcaster, but where we can also make criticism when necessary. And I think that the current public broadcaster does deserve some criticism. So just before getting into the meat of the matter, let me start with a quick aside. Let me remind us that at this time of the year, we are honoring members of our armed forces who have served over the years and decades, who fought in world conflicts. Many made the ultimate sacrifice. Most parliamentarians are wearing the poppy pin, as are many Hill staffers and employees. And I think it's very important to remember that many people gave their lives for the freedom we have today. And I would just say that from a protocol perspective, I would remind colleagues that the poppy needs to be placed above any other badge or pin. I would just remind our colleagues of that in case they need to readjust their clothing while they're in the lobby. So as I was saying, there are criticisms we may make about CBC Radio-Canada, especially under Catherine Tate's mandate. I was not a great fan of many of her decisions. Many things that she did during her tenure, which I believe went on for too long, thanks to the Minister of Heritage at the time. Well, I have my doubts about many things she's done. I think she missed opportunities to do the right thing. She missed opportunities to make the right decision. For example, the idea of getting a podcast translated in Paris instead of having it done by Quebec figures and the dubbing industry in Quebec is extremely fine, perhaps one of the best in the world. It was a real mark of disrespect to the Francophone community, when she should have shown just as much respect for it as for the Anglophone community. So that was quite shocking. And then some of her decisions seemed to be motivated by ideology rather than common sense. Although lately, the term common sense, well, sometimes it's a bit delicate using it. But for example, there was a huge scandal around the title of a book by Simon Jaudoin and the use of the N-word. This scandal blew up. And as for Mr. Bissonnette, a man whose career and whose credibility can barely be cast into doubt, can scarcely be cast into doubt, well, he ultimately left the broadcaster because his convictions were violated. That just shows that things were not going well there. Then, only a few weeks before Christmas last year, major cuts were announced. This was on December 4th, 2023, and 250 positions were cut, each on CBC and Radio-Canada. More positions were cut by attrition, for a total of around 800 positions. Such a decision to engage in these cuts and to spread them out equally between the French and English sides, well, it was unacceptable. First of all, it is extremely important that we protect our public broadcasters' Francophone services and Radio-Canada, which is performing very well and which is meeting or exceeding its targets.
That offers high-quality productions that viewers love and content that various users on various platforms love as well, on TV, on the radio, digitally. And Radio-Canada, CBC Radio-Canada, operates, well, Radio-Canada has fewer resources than CBC, and so cutting 500 positions was meant to be equally prevalent between CBC and Radio-Canada. But those cuts were the straw that broke the camel's back. What were the consequences, Madam Speaker? Over the next few months, employees that didn't know if their positions were going to be cut or not had this Damocles' sword above their heads, which was a lack of judgment for those making decisions. Now, I have criticised Ms. Tate, but I would like to distance myself from the Conservatives. We can't misinterpret facts just to serve our ideology or our convictions or an idea or a populist plan, as would be the one that would see the defunding of CBC. We know that the leader of the official opposition wants to defund the CBC. I thought it's because the leader of the Conservatives is allergic to quality journalism. Why? Because quality journalism will call him out on ineptitudes. A rigorous journalist will receive information, will analyse it, and will make sure that Canadians and Quebecers aren't fed with misinformation. Madam Speaker, everything's not perfect, perfectly covered by CBC Radio-Canada, but I'm of a firm mind that this is an organisation that works with stringent and rigorous standards, the highest in North America and even in the world. CBC Radio-Canada takes inspiration from other public broadcasters. They all inspire each other, of course. They're all generally associated. But I know that inspiration is taken here from what's happening elsewhere, and elsewhere takes inspiration from us. We can criticise CBC Radio-Canada. There are complaints mechanisms. If the Conservative leader wants to file a complaint, he can do so. Anyone can do so. There's a mechanism for this. And corrections are brought to reports because if the complaint is founded, if a piece of information is incorrect or was miscommunicated or was biased, then it can be changed. But the Conservatives' predisposition to, let's say, somewhat manipulate the facts, play with the truth, be slightly creative with information, so that readers, listeners, and the population receive information that's provided to them in the most shocking format possible, to shock them, by saying that the government's incompetent or that the House can't work under the Liberals in power. Through this way of doing things, they can't afford having a rigorous public broadcaster. And I think that is the main reason for which the Leader of the Opposition wants to defund CBC Radio-Canada, because the Conservatives or the CBC Radio-Canada keeps calling them out. It's not bad journalism, it's just rigour. Should CBC Radio-Canada continue under the current model? I think not. Quite the contrary. A lot of things should be reopened. I wouldn't go into the details. The Minister is going to move a new terms of reference or a new mandate for the next few years. But there's some things to revisit. CBC Radio-Canada needs to be able to face the industry-wide crisis. Digital giants, opening media, digital media in general, access that one has to information through digital media. Yes, it's important to regulate this, but that there's so much information that people go to a varied number of sources. We have to face these challenges. The advertisement market has also become huge and varied. There's so much competition that we have to think about the way that our public broadcaster will be funded. Is advertisements for CBC Radio Canada a good idea? Well, I think that this notion should be questioned. If we want CBC Radio Canada to be fully independent, we want them to be neutral and rigorous in their processing information, advertisements cast this into doubt. Removing advertisement money from CBC Radio Canada opens to another type of funding, which is public funding. Are Canadians and Quebecers ready to increase CBC Radio Canada's funding so that they don't have to rely on advertisers? That's a whole different conversation. And that's the kind of conversation we can't have when on one side it's just misinformation and slogans, and let's defund CBC because they're this and that. It's the government's propaganda mouthpiece. We need to be adults and have real non-puerile debates about CBC Radio Canada. Do we want CBC Radio Canada? If people don't want a public broadcaster, then it can simply just be thrown in the trash and we'll move on to something else. But when Canadians were asked if they wanted a public broadcaster, 83% said yes, we do like our public broadcaster. That's a lot of people. 83% of people saying we don't want to lose CBC Radio Canada. If you go to Quebec and you ask Quebecers if they want to lose Radio-Canada and Francophone services, the percentage is even higher. Why? Because this is part of their cultural and television life landscape, rather. It's part of their culture, their Francophone culture. It's an indispensable asset. Very high quality productions that are exported throughout the world that were produced by Radio-Canada in Quebec. That's impressive. And we can't do without. So the main question, do we want a public broadcaster? Well, if we ask the main stakeholders that are Quebecers and Canadians, the answer is yes. So from that, we can ask new questions. If we want to be efficient, we can ask questions that circumvent populism. Then we can work on something. And the Conservatives, now were they really willing to be productive, if they really want to do their job, then they would ask the right questions, saying we don't want bonuses. Okay, then let's revisit the public broadcaster's remuneration framework. Let us compare what happens in other countries with public broadcasters. Australia, for example. Madam Speaker, the CEO of ABC, which is Australia's public broadcaster, it's $1.2 million a year. Ms. Tate is about $600,000. Okay. So is that comparable? 600,000 compared to $1.2 million? We could say, well, 500,000 is nothing compared to the CEO of Bell that gets $13 million. Because if it were to be in the private sector, it would be 5, 6, 7 times more than what Ms. Tate gets now. So we could have a responsible and enlightened discussion on the matter with real comparatives by saying we want this and we want this at high quality. And to get quality, we have to sometimes disperse for it. A lot of people think that CBC Radio Canada costs a fortune. It's so expensive, it's horrible. If we were to Conservatives, people are going to food banks because of CBC Radio Canada. I feel like we're about to get that soundbite from them, but I just want to say that Canadians pay $31 a year for the benefits of CBC Radio Canada, television, radio, digital content, and international coverage that we would not have had the opportunity to pay for if there were only private broadcasters. Let us compare $31 a year per person. Let's compare it to other countries, because I said, Madam Speaker, if we want a public broadcaster, and that seems to be the general consensus, we want CBC Radio Canada to exist. So if we want CBC Radio Canada, we have to compare ourselves to see what happens elsewhere, as I said. $31 a year per person. In Switzerland, they have a public broadcaster. It costs them $191 per person per year. In Sweden, We love comparing ourselves to Sweden. We love comparing ourselves to Scandinavian countries because it's a utopia over there, some say. It's a smaller country, 9 million people. They have a public broadcaster. It costs $106 per person per year. And no one seems to be complaining there. Some more comparisons. The gold standard of public broadcasting, the most well-known, the most prestigious, the BBC. British people spend $96 a year, or pays $96 a year for the British Broadcasting Corporation. So $31 isn't scandalous for what we get in return. Now, does that mean that we shouldn't doubt it? No, no, no. We should still be asking questions. Does that mean that everything is done well? Absolutely not, Madam Speaker. Does that mean that we shouldn't examine how people are paid? No. Quite the contrary. We must ask questions, but we need to do it in an adult and responsible way and in a productive way, not just with slogans. Let's defund CBC because Catherine Tate gave $18 million in bonus just this year. Now, I'd like to come back to the question of bonuses and remuneration, because there's nothing easier than causing ripples. Misinformation can be spread in 5 seconds. It's very quick. Once it's said, when you want to reinform this misinformation, correct it and tell people that it's misinformation and it's wrong and here are the facts, that takes a lot more energy and due diligency, because half the people will still swallow the misinformation wholesale. Taking the bonuses that were granted to the executives and turning that money into a scandalous argument about the management or mismanagement of CBC Radio Canada is akin to clear exaggerations. We need to make comparatives to other public broadcasters. $80 million in bonus to executives and to staff while job cuts are being announced, where budget reductions are being announced, and where the government has to ask for more money. Yes, I understand that some people may be cynical, might see it indecent to be paying executives that much. But we have context. Now, first of all, I'm not a big fan of Ms. Tate, but she appeared before the committee a number of times. She explained how CBC Radio Canada works, that she didn't implement herself. She explained how it works, how the remuneration system works, and it was questionable. It was perhaps prone to being revisited, but it wasn't a scandal to the degree that we hear decried by the Conservatives. Yes, the remuneration system should be revisited for executives, for upper management, and for all staff. Why not? Yes. Yes, we should have a discussion on how we can make sure that people are happy with salaries. When salaries are announced, people say, yes, we're aware, it's fair enough, that's worth it. Yes to that discussion, but no to this misinformation, no to this demonization of a public broadcaster that has the potential of being even better than it already is, and that is one of the most credible sources of information that we have here in Quebec and in Canada. Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for the Environment and Climate Change. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I had the honour of working with the Honourable Member at the Heritage Committee, and we worked on how we can work on getting a lot of Canadian content for Quebecer voices. And he spoke about how we can make sure that these Canadian and Quebecer stories are heard. Why does he think that the Conservatives don't want to hear Canadian and Quebec stories? The Honourable Member for Drummond. I would like to thank my colleague for her question, Madam Speaker. It's true that we did good work. on C10, which then became C11, which then became the Broadcasting Act. The reason is because the Conservatives do not want to see anything that would improve CBC Radio Canada. They just want to try and find a tiny breach that they can then blow up to make it sensational, to make it scandalous, so that people don't think about what could be good with CBC Radio Canada. They want people to focus on anything that could be scandalous or reprehensible. We can't move forward when someone does not want to move forward.
It's the honourable member for Saskatoon-Grasswood.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my block member from Drummond, who's been on the Heritage Committee for years with myself. It's interesting, the CBC, when they did their cuts last year, started in Quebec. CBC Radio Canada, 25% listenership in the province of Quebec, and yet the CBC executives decided to hit CBC Radio Canada first. 800 employees lost their job. $18 million then were presented in bonuses, $3.3 million to the executives. I know my friend from Drummond has been on the committee for a long time, but when Google came out with $100 million to help the industry, guess who was at the trough first? CBC, who he complained about being at the trough with Google. I would like to have the honourable member from Drummond talk about Google and CBC putting their hand again in the public broadcaster, trying to get more money out of the public.
The honourable member for Drummond. I'd like to thank my colleague. We work well together at the committee. Sometimes we don't agree, but we agree on many things. And we both hold to heart quality journalism and the industry as a whole. With regards to announced cuts, I said it in my speech, we found them unacceptable. It was unacceptable that the cuts were equal between CBC and Radio Canada. The announcements made in December, that being said, it's not. What we see is 600 people throughout CBC Radio Canada who had democracy's sword above their head because they didn't know if their jobs were going to be cut or not. 300 people were cut. It's still a lot. It's still too much, especially when these cuts come with announced bonuses. Answers have to be given to the public. We have to revisit CBC Radio Canada's payment scheme, and that is an important conversation to have. The honourable member for Churchill-Kwanuk-Aski. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleague for having raised very important questions on the importance of Canada, and he raised how important it is and essential it is for Canada. I would like to highlight the fact that Radio-Canada in particular here in Western Canada does excellent work for Francophone communities. That being said, it's clear that reform is needed. We want to protect it as a public broadcaster, we want to support it, but these executive bonuses in the current climate is wholly unacceptable. Does the Bloc agree with banning executive bonuses for CBC Radio Canada?
Député de Drummond.
The honourable member for Drummond. Well, a couple of interesting points, but first of all, my colleague talked about coverage in the regions in rural Canada. I didn't talk much about that in my speech, but Radio Canada has a mission, and a mission that it's having a hard time delivering right now. There is regions of Quebec and Canada, and certainly there are improvements that could be made at that level. In terms of bonuses, well, Madam Speaker, I've said many times that I think that we need to review how pay is managed at CBC Radio Canada, and I think that needs to be part of a review of the mandate of the public broadcaster. But whatever is decided, whatever happens, it will always be essential that the public broadcaster remain protected from any political interference. And for somebody here to tell CBC Radio Canada that it's not allowed to give out bonuses, that sort of thing, I think that would be extremely inappropriate. That having been said, do we need to question what we can question about how they manage pay? Certainly, yes, we need to do that. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague from Drummond for his excellent presentation. He's a great communicator and a great defender of Quebec's culture, and I'd like to thank him for the great work he's been doing over the last 5 years. In the current debate, there's an amendment that's just been proposed by the government, and it raises a number of questions for me. I think that there's an interesting point there, and as a member from a rural area, the impact of Radio Canada is very important. But what I'm questioning is does the government really are they really interested in the ecosystem of regional media? I'd like to hear my colleagues' thoughts. What do we need to do to make sure that local independent media has the resources and the means that they need to make sure that they can tell our stories in rural areas? The Honourable Member for Drummond. Well, I think it's very interesting what my colleague from Abitibi-Témiscamingue has just raised. If we're going to review our public broadcaster, we could look at how CBC Radio Canada could contribute to collaboration between the public broadcaster and small, local, independent media who are essential when it comes to providing coverage in rural areas which are often underserved. And, that kind of coverage is absolutely essential to democracy. So we can look at the means that we have with a public broadcaster, which has spread its tentacles pretty much everywhere, but doesn't always have the means right now to use those resources to their full extent. If they could work to support, for example, regional media, that might be a very good solution to look at. But I certainly agree we need to do a lot more for our regional media, particularly in far-flung rural areas. Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Speaker, I like and appreciate how the member highlighted, whether it's CBC Radio Canada or the CBC in general, and how we as communities have benefited greatly by their presence. And if you take a look at what other progressive nations around the world have, these are jewels. And it is something in which we do need to preserve. And at times, it doesn't mean that there's no sense of accountability. And that's the reason why I think we have standing committees in good part, is to ensure that there is a higher sense of accountability. And I'm wondering if the member could provide his thoughts on whether or not he's inclined to support the motion that we put forward.
The Honourable Member for Drummond. Well, thank you. I'd like to thank my colleague from Winnipeg North for his question, Madam Speaker. I have his amendment to the motion in front of me. Here, I have it, in hand. And listen, I'm not against doing a study of the consequences and the impact that cutting CBC's funding could have. I think that could be a very relevant study for the committee to do. Will I support it or not? Well, I'm not sure. I'll certainly give it some thought. And I'd maybe like to think about how we could look at the impacts of media coverage in media deserts right now. We know that there are many regions that don't have any journalism coverage right now, and maybe that could be part of the study. So I'd also like to talk about, if you'll allow me, Madam Speaker, I'd like to answer another aspect of his question, which was more of a comment on the importance of having a quality public broadcaster. We all are glued to our screens when there are major worldwide sporting events, when there are, the opening ceremonies of the Olympics, for example. We're all so happy to be able to watch that. But what that implies as a cost of spending, the production that it costs to send, for example, teams to Paris to cover the Olympic Games, as we saw in Paris, it's a huge cost. So if we didn't have a public broadcaster to offer high-quality coverage, I don't know who would offer it. Probably a foreign media giant, but that's one of the advantages of having a quality public broadcaster. Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Churchill-Kiewatnakaski.
Merci, Madame
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
I rise today to speak to the following main motion, that given the job cuts announced at CBC Radio Canada for the year 2024, it would be inappropriate for the CBC to grant bonuses to executive members, end quote. The NDP supports this motion, but what I find fascinating is that it's coming from the Conservatives. the same Conservatives who have finally met an executive bonus that they oppose. That's how ideologically committed they are, that their love of billionaires and millionaires trying to join them can be overcome to the point that they'll oppose excessive executive bonuses, but only as long as those bonuses are going to CBC executives. Anyone else, they'd be fine with it. Which is why I think it really is a misnomer when Liberals say the Conservatives hate the CBC. I'm not sure that they do. In fact, I would argue that the Conservatives, in fact, love the CBC. And love, in particular, that someone like Catherine Tate has so poorly run the CBC that they found the one group of executives they can rail against. They love that they can comfortably attack these executives and hope that no one notices that they'll cater to every other that they cater to every other wealthy executive. As we've heard here today, it's the same Conservatives who are spending significant resources to advertise on the CBC as well. Would the Conservatives argue against bonuses of oil executives who are ravaging the planet? A report released by the Bedford Consulting Group looked at executive compensation at 68 oil and gas companies. While Canadians struggle to fill up their car, executive bonuses increased over 20%. The average compensation for executives at companies with assets over $30 billion was over $16.6 million. Did the Conservatives speak up when it came to these executive bonuses? Of course not. They really love these ones. Galen Weston's bonuses increased by over 50% in a single year, while at the same time his board argued that he was underpaid. I'm sure my Liberal and Conservative friends agree. If they didn't, they would have supported an NDP effort to tie executive pay to workers. But they don't, because once again, they love these bonuses. Speaking of telecommunications, Bell Media. Mirko Bibic received over $13 million in bonuses in a single year while laying off thousands of workers. And yet Conservatives and Liberals approve millions of dollars in taxpayers' money sent directly to Bell Media. And it's clear why the Conservatives are so beholden to corporate interests, especially when the Conservative Party has at least 5 billionaire donors, 2 in real estate, which is also probably why the Conservative leader refuses to take on corporate landlords, making buying a house unattainable for young Canadians. 2 donors in finance, which is why the Conservative leader joined the Liberals in voting against closing tax loopholes that allow billionaires to hide their money in offshore tax havens. And 1 billionaire donor who sells food and other basic needs, which is probably why the Conservatives joined the Liberals to block an excess profit tax for grocery stores. Yet Conservatives still complain when the NDP forces the Liberals to deliver for Canadians, fighting for billions in housing, for First Nations, for pharmacare and dental care, so Canadians don't have to make impossible choices, to increase the fight for increased union power by banning scab labor. And it's because the idea of standing up for anything is so anathema to the Conservatives. While the Conservatives like to go on and on about a coalition of the Liberal and the NDP, they hide the real coalition in this country, one of corporate greed enabled by 2 political parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, who prefer to do nothing while Canadians struggle. The reality is 56 of the richest Canadians donate to the Liberal Party, while 61 have donated to the Conservative Party. The wealthiest people in this country do not see a difference between Liberals and Conservatives. So, excuse me if I ask to be spared of the Conservative crocodile tears about CBC bonuses. CBC bonuses are wrong, and the NDP is clear that they are wrong. A public broadcaster, a crown corporation, should not be doling out executive bonuses, especially at a time when they are making cuts and they're failing to fulfill their regional broadcasting mandates. But I would argue the Conservatives don't actually care about executive bonuses. What they really care about is hurting the CBC. That's why the leader of the Conservatives will appear on True North, a conspiracy theory website that platforms banned far-right hate groups like the Proud Boys, where he proclaims that he can't wait to defund the CBC. This plays right into Liberal hands. The Liberals can demonize the Conservative leader for wanting to destroy the CBC, and ignore their own record of doing exactly that. It was after their threat of a 3% cut across the board that Catherine Tate and her board decided to lay off 800 workers. It was under this government that the CBC's workforce has shrunken to the point that it's smaller than it was under the Stephen Harper government. Those dark days when it came to cuts to the CBC. We're once again seeing the Liberal special criticize the Conservatives for doing what the Liberals do by stealth. The end result is Canadians are losing out. Because while the CBC cuts jobs across the country, it's really Canadians who are paying the price. It's Canadians, especially in northern, rural, Indigenous communities living in media deserts who don't have their stories told. When the CBC relies on offices in Winnipeg and elsewhere to tell the stories of people like here in northern Manitoba and in other northern and rural regions of the country, it's all Canadians that lose out. We lose out on our stories, our voices, and our reality that matters to all of us. As media becomes more concentrated, we hear less about how the 20 richest Canadians have $214 billion in wealth, equivalent to over 10% of Canada's GDP. 20 people, 10% of the country in terms of GDP. This reality is unsustainable, and we need to do something about it. We hear less about how 123 corporations get out of paying $30 billion in taxes in a single year, relying on loopholes that the NDP has called on the government to close. But Liberals and Conservatives, once again, do everything they can to keep those loopholes open. Madam Speaker, I want to go back to the Liberal sub-amendment to this debate as well. Here they are, once again, coming across that they want to do something when it comes to saving the CBC. But the reality is that we know that the threats to cut the CBC made by the Liberals, in fact, contributed to an environment where the CBC went ahead and cut 800 positions not too long ago. The Liberals talk a good talk when it comes to the CBC, but the reality is they're doing little to strengthen a public broadcaster and pursue the kind of accountability that Canadians deserve. A couple of months ago, when the story first broke that executive bonuses had been doled out at the CBC, we released the following statement. It's time to ban the CBC from paying bonuses. The Liberals have failed to act. When CBC President Catherine Tate came to committee, I made it clear that the CBC is acting more and more like a private broadcaster, including on bonuses. Canadians deserve better. I also called on President Tate to commit to canceling executive bonuses to save CBC jobs. And now we hear that not only did they take the bonuses, but they add up to more than $18 million. This while Canadians lost their jobs at the CBC. Unlike the Conservatives who want to cut the CBC, we want accountability and we want to improve it. The Liberals have overseen a CBC that has not fulfilled its regional mandate the way it ought to. Earlier, we heard about cuts to Radio-Canada, which is an essential service for Francophone communities, for Quebec, for regions in our country like New Brunswick, where Radio-Canada is the go-to broadcaster for Francophones. But we also know that the CBC has cut and failed to fulfill its mandate in regions like mine, here in northern Manitoba, where for years we have not had a permanent presence to fill our local broadcasting station known as CBC North Country. And in fact, very cynically, the president of the CBC, President Tate, when she came to our committee in, I believe it was May of this year, declared that the position here had been filled. When we went on to find out that it was a journalist who came in for 2 months as a secondment from another CBC office in elsewhere in Canada. To me and to our region, that was a cynical message from the CBC, that they were willing to get away with a PR messaging that they'd filled this critical position, a position that they are mandated to fill, and but in fact, the person that filled it was only here for 2 months. I want to recognize that over these past years, the fact that we haven't had a CBC presence has meant that the CBC coverage of our region has not been up to par. One-off stories about our communities don't cut it when it comes to relaying the real issues, challenges, opportunities, good news, bad news stories that need to be told on behalf of our region. We also know that the CBC has not built the relationships on the ground to be able to convey the stories that people have to share, stories that undoubtedly inform Canadians' view of what's happening in Northern Canada, what's happening in Indigenous communities, what's happening in resource-based communities, many of whom are facing immense challenges, but are also pursuing exciting opportunities. Our voices and these stories are not being told as a result of the CBC failing to fill the position here in our station that at one time had 3 people working in it, was reduced as a result of cuts to 1, and now, as I mentioned, it's been years that position has been fulfilled. I will note that our region has a proud history for when it comes to the CBC. It is, I believe, the first region that had full-time programming in Cree, again based here in northern Manitoba. It was also the region that gave Peter Mansbridge its start. He was discovered in Churchill, interestingly enough, not broadcasting, but working at the airport. And it is said that a CBC producer heard his voice and thought he would be great for radio. And of course, went on to have an illustrious career broadcasting for the CBC. Our region has a rich history when it comes to broadcasting and the CBC. But instead of respecting that, instead of living up to their obligations under the CRTC and their mandate for regional programming, the CBC has failed to fill this position. And I want to raise the issue of leadership. Some years ago, when when it was announced that our station would be shut down, this was under the Harper government, we worked closely with then President Hubert Lacroix. He listened to our communities, he worked with our communities, and we were able to restore service here in northern Manitoba. This was much appreciated. Here, people in northern Manitoba felt heard by the CBC at that time. Contrast that to Ms. Tate's leadership, where we haven't seen support for this station, and just a short-term fill, which is not a solution to the broadcasting needs of our region and CBC's mandate. And in fact, when I raised this issue in committee just last week, the answers I received were entirely inadequate and frankly irrelevant. Ms. Tate went on to talk about other regions in the country. That's not what this was about. Regions like ours, Northern Canada, Indigenous communities deserve local and regional broadcasting in their regions, telling their stories. And that's why I believe it is critical that we talk about strengthening the CBC and ensuring that we are investing in the regional and local journalism that's required. This is especially urgent at a time when private broadcasters are pulling out from regions across the country. We saw record cuts made by Bell Media. We've seen cuts in the loss of broadcasting as Rogers took over Shaw. We've seen cuts in, by media outlets across the country. And what we have now is entire media deserts, parts of our country where people are not based, journalists are not based to tell the stories within these regions. This makes Canada less well off in terms of in terms of our connections. This is absolutely a hindrance to our to building an informed citizenry. It is a hit to our democracy in many ways, where Canadians do not have access and the knowledge of the stories of people even within their own regions, provinces, and parts of the country. We also know that it's a contributor to misinformation, people turning elsewhere to get the news, and not necessarily to reputable sites and reputable sources. And of course, we know that the far right has taken advantage of this void and sought to push its agenda through. I want to conclude by indicating that while we support the banning of executive bonuses, we certainly do not support the Conservatives' full frontal attack on the CBC and Radio-Canada. We need a strong public broadcaster, but not one that doles out executive bonuses and cuts jobs, not one that doesn't fulfill local and regional broadcasting mandates like we're seeing right now with the CBC, not one that is failing to tell Canadian stories from across the country. We need a public broadcaster, a CBC that is accountable to Canadians, that has as its priority local and regional journalism. And we also need to cut through the Liberal games. The Liberals who have threatened to cut the CBC, the Liberals who have overseen the doling out of $18 million in bonuses, the Liberals who have failed to ensure CBC fulfills its local and regional broadcasting mandates. Canadians deserve a strong CBC, an accountable CBC, a CBC that puts Canadians at the center, that doesn't prioritize bonuses, that doesn't leave glaring gaps when it comes to local and regional broadcasting. And with that in mind, I would like to make an amendment to the sub-amendment. I propose that the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the word that and substituting the following. The 8th report of the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage presented on Tuesday, December 12, 2023, be not now concurred in, but that it be recommitted to the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage for further consideration, provided that it be an instruction to the committee to study the consequences of defunding the CBC and Radio-Canada, including how the Liberals' threat to cut funding led to hundreds of CBC Radio-Canada job cuts, including the effects on smaller communities, as promised by the Leader of the Official Opposition. I hope my fellow colleagues will support the amendment we are putting forward, but more importantly, that as Canadian parliamentarians, we can get behind strengthening our public broadcaster, rendering it accountable by banning executive bonuses and investing in local and regional journalism. Canadians deserve it. Thank you.
Just a moment. I will just check to make sure that the amendment to the motion is in order. Alors, pendant qu'on regarde à la motion...
While we're looking at this, I will just suspend the House before moving on to questions and comments so that I can determine if the motion is in order.